Well, good morning. So I am awkwardly trying to record myself. We'll see how this works. It'll take me a little getting used to doing this. I'll have to figure out how to make it look and sound best. Um, but still, here I am. This is going to be our first Bible study. I'm calling this study "Living the Resurrection." Easter to be believed and lived. This isn't just Easter isn't just a doctrine. It has to do with living a certain way. And I want to start today with the oldest of the gospel accounts, the Gospel of Mark. Today I'm going to probably talk, 15, 20 minutes, just a little teaching, some background segments. I'll try to do this each week. This isn't meant to take the place of your own personal Bible study, but just maybe to give you some things that you wouldn't get on your own, just, the things I'm pulling out of books and other scholars. So I'm going to hope this works well. I'll see. I'll watch this when I get done. And again, I hope I'll get better at doing this as we go along. So I'm going to begin by praying. Gracious God, we're thankful for the Gospels, these good news accounts of what happened in and through your Son. And I pray that this morning you'll use me, but that all of us in the end will be the learners of you, the great teacher. For we pray this in your name. Amen. So today we're looking at the gospel account at the end of Mark, Mark chapter 16. You'll see, if you look at this in your own Bible, you'll see that most Bibles make a break with verse 8. And then there are, like in my Bible, it says the earliest manuscripts and some other ancient witnesses do not have verses 9 through 20. So I'll say a little bit about that in just a bit. I'm just going to deal with the first 8 verses, which I believe is sort of the right place to end this gospel as we have it for right now. So let me first just make some comments about the gospel according to Mark. According to tradition, Mark is the author, but Mark is actually Peter's gospel. We don't have a Mark in the Gospels as a disciple of Jesus. He was, according to tradition, a follower, a disciple of Peter's. And then, so Peter narrated this gospel, which Mark wrote down. I'm going to read something. This is an ancient witness to this idea. It comes from a bishop in Turkey between the years 90 and 100, so right there in the first century. His name was Papias, Papias. Here's his quote. Mark became Peter's interpreter and wrote accurately all that he remembered, not indeed in order of the things said or done by the Lord. For Mark had not heard the Lord, nor had he followed him. But later on, as I said, he followed Peter, who used to give teachings as necessity demanded, but not making, as it were, an arrangement of the Lord's oracles, so that Mark did nothing wrong in thus writing down single points as he remembered them. For one thing, he gave attention to leave nothing out of what he heard and to make no false statements in them. So what that's essentially saying is we may not have things in the right order, but Peter wasn't teaching in always the right order. Maybe in one setting he told a particular story of Jesus, and Mark recorded those things. So even in the first century, they weren't overly concerned was this all exactly in the right order, but he accurately recorded what Peter had said. I think it's fair to say that the Gospel of Mark was the first of the Gospels written probably sometime in the mid to late 60s. So that is only, 30 years or so after the time of Jesus. So there are still plenty of eyewitnesses around. This is the first, the first generation people of the Jesus story are still there, many of them. Which would have a certain way of limiting how far out could a narrator go. There were people who would have said, well, no, I was there. That isn't the way it happened. We know that Peter was martyred during the reign of Nero. Nero was the Roman emperor from 54 to 68. So we know that the Gospel of Mark has to come from some time before that. Just a couple of literary features of Mark. It's the shortest of Gospels. It's very fast-paced. It emphasizes what Jesus does far more than it emphasizes what Jesus teaches. So Mark will frequently tell us that Jesus was a teacher, but then it doesn't tell us what he taught. It just says, and Jesus taught the crowds, and then it just moves on. So you get a quick repetition, or not repetition, but a quick succession of stories, one thing right after the other. One of the favorite words that Mark uses is the word immediately, is used all over the gospel. Also, there is another interesting little technique in Mark's gospel. It's sometimes called a sandwich technique. And what that means essentially is Mark will begin to tell a story, and then that story will get interrupted with another story. That story will be completed, and then it comes back to the first story. The classic example of this would be in Mark 5:21-43. I'd encourage you to look at that story because there's the classic example of this sandwich technique. So it's the story of Jairus, the synagogue ruler. His daughter is sick. So he comes to Jesus asking if Jesus wouldn't come to his house to heal his daughter. As Jesus is on the way, the woman who is bleeding reaches out and touches Jesus. And now you get that whole bleeding woman story. What had happened to her, how she was healed, then Jesus seeking her out. That story comes to its end. And then Jesus is back on his way to Jairus' house, but leaders come or people come from Jairus' home saying, don't waste your time because your daughter's already died. But Jesus says, no, we're still going to go. And then that story is finished. And the key to this isn't just interrupting a story, but the key becomes that the centerpiece, so the story of the bleeding woman, ends up holding the key for Jairus and his story. He's ready to give up hope. But what he's just seen in action, a woman who had no hope either, how her story came to a good end, that becomes the encouragement for him to believe. Hold on, Jairus. Just because your daughter's already died, this story isn't over either. So that's a sort of a cool little technique that Mark likes to use. I'm going to note one other thing. So, and this is an odd little piece, but we know the early Christians were fond of making this sort of comparison and this connection. There is in the first chapter of Ezekiel. So Ezekiel is an odd book, and it gets off to a very unusual beginning in Ezekiel 1. But if you read Ezekiel 1, start with verse 10 and read through the end of that chapter, there's this vision of this creature that has multiple faces. The same thing is in Revelation 4:7. So read that passage, Revelation 4:7 and following. So, and what you have is this odd creature with four faces. There's the face of a man, the face of a lion, the face of an eagle, and the face of an ox. What the early Christians did was they said those four faces were somehow representative of the four gospel accounts. And they connected them like this. They said Matthew is the face of a man because Matthew focuses on Jesus as a teacher. Mark is the lion, the face of the lion. There isn't much teaching, but there's a lot of action. So it's like a lion. Jesus is like a lion on the prowl. Luke is like the ox. Luke is the longest of the Gospels. In some ways, it's a slow-moving gospel, the way an ox moves. It doesn't move quickly, but, used as a plow animal, the ox just, digs the ground up and just changes the landscape. And John is the face of the eagle. John is sort of the high-flying gospel. The gospel that doesn't look at specific details, but wants to get a big, sort of see the lay of the land. Where the other gospels will start with either the nativity stories of Jesus or Mark starts right away with Jesus as an adult. John, you go In the beginning was the Word. He's going all the way to the beginning. So he's giving us the big picture, an eagle's eye view of the entire story. And I think that's sort of a nice way. If you're interested in this, I'm going to refer you to a really great book by a British scholar. His name is Richard Burridge. And the book is called Four Gospels, One Jesus. It's super interesting. It's in paperback. I think it costs like $15 or so on Amazon. But a really great book that kind of looks at the characteristics of each of the Gospels and how they then come together to give us one picture of Jesus. So now let's take a look at Mark 16, 1-8. Again, I've already mentioned why is it that we're stopping at 8? Why don't we go through these other verses that are tagged on there? Again, as I've said, the earliest manuscripts. So when it says manuscripts, we have all these different documents, ancient documents that are the Gospels. And here's what we know of all the different manuscript editions that we have of Mark. The oldest ones end at verse 8. So these verses 9 through 20 are not included in the oldest manuscripts. You give more historical weight to the older a document is. So, and what most scholars have said is that these verses 9 through 20 are additions, are add-ons. That someone or groups did not like the way Mark ended at verse 8. So they sort of finished the story using other gospel accounts or other sources. They added some verses. It is worth noting that those additions are also quite old. And mostly they use as their sources the other three gospel accounts, what happened in the resurrection. But I do think it's best to conclude that Mark ended there at verse 8. One of my favorite scholars is a guy named N.T. Wright or Tom Wright. Wright believes that the gospel did not end there at verse 8, that there was more, but that section got lost. It was the end of a manuscript, and he says it's not uncommon that manuscripts would lose their last page. Yeah, and it's sort of like the last page of a book. Like if you've read a book a bunch of times, sometimes it starts falling apart a little bit. And, tendencies would be maybe for first and last pages to come off. So Wright thinks there was something more, but we don't have that. And that the 9-20 is not what was originally there. It seems a little out of step with the way that Mark writes. So, and that's a possibility too. I'm not sure, I'm not a scholar how to resolve that, but I think we can read Mark's resurrection account in Mark 16 and say, no, this is truly a legitimately a way to end the gospel. So we're going to read this together. I'm not going to read it right now. I'm just going to make some introductory comments, just some things worth noting. First, verse 1. When the Sabbath was over, all four Gospels are agreed that the resurrection happened when the Sabbath was over. The Sabbath, of course, is the Jewish holy day. It was the seventh or final day of the week. So, and that's a Saturday. What the Gospels are agreed on is that the resurrection happened on a Sunday. Now, we think of Sunday as being a special day because it is a special day for us as Christians and in the church. But Sunday would not have been a special day in the first century for Jewish people. Sunday was the first day of the week. It was the day you went back to work. In one sense, their Sunday would be the equivalent of our Monday. And that's an interesting little piece that maybe we'll get to talk about. Sunday is the first day of the work week. Sunday is the first day of the creation week. When God started creating the world in Genesis 1, the first day is Sunday. So let's be thinking a little bit about that, the significance of that. The story then continues. Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so they might go to anoint Jesus' body. And here is just the absolutely significant idea. And again, all four gospel accounts are agreed on this, that the earliest witnesses to the resurrection were women. And that is a critically important piece. I want to read a really interesting quote from my friend Jim Edwards, his commentary on Mark, the Gospel according to Mark. And so it's just one paragraph, but I think it just highlights why this is so important. The presence of women's names attests to the relatively early dating of Mark's Gospel. It also attests to the veracity of the resurrection narrative. For had early Christians fabricated the resurrection story, the testimony of women in all four Gospels was no way to go about it. Some 2 centuries after the Gospels were written, the pagan Celsus could still needle Origen, a Christian bishop, on, quote, the gossip of women about the empty tomb. The witness of Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, Salome, and especially Mary Magdalene, whose name heads the resurrection witnesses in all four Gospels, endows the resurrection narratives with the highest degree of probability. Unless women were actually present at the tomb, the early church would scarcely have placed them there, since Judaism did not accept the testimony of women. The testimony of women is, however, entirely in character with the divine economy. Those whose testimony is discounted by human society are the first to be included in the divine society. And Jim references 1 Corinthians 1, 26 through 28. So take a look at that passage. You get the point. The point is, if you were going to make up a story in the first century, you would not have women being the principal witnesses to that story, because people would have heard that and would have said, well, it's just a bunch of women saying that. How can I be expected to believe that? So, and we'll think about what might be the significance of that for our lives. Then in verses 3 and 4, listen to what the women are concerned about. Let's see, verse 3. They ask each other, who will roll the stone away from the entrance to the tomb? They have but one concern as they make their way and to the tomb where Jesus' body would have been placed. They're not concerned about how are we going to react to the resurrection of Jesus. They're only worried about who's going to roll the stone. Is there going to be somebody in the guard, maybe a worker? Will there be somebody there to help us roll this mammoth stone away from the front of Jesus' tomb? So, they are concerned. And of course, when it then says that when they got there, they found the stone had been rolled away. One of the things that does for us is it tells us that what has happened here is entirely the doing of Jesus or of God. God did this. No people were involved. They get there. There isn't anything for them to do. The stone is already moved away. God is at work, and that stone becomes a part of the witness to that. They find a young man there. He's dressed in a white robe. This seems indicative in the Bible of an angel. There's numerous other accounts of this. But what it is that they feel is summed up in the word, they were alarmed. That word carries with it the idea of fear, but also wonder, astonishment, distress. The women don't know what to make of what has happened. But once again, they do not simply look at this and say, oh, Jesus is raised from the dead. That they do not think. The message of the angel, don't be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene who was crucified. And this is an important piece to note, the connection of the resurrection to the crucifixion. This seems part and parcel of one story. It can't be separated. But it's important to say that we can't only talk about a resurrection. A resurrection is meaningless apart from the crucifixion. And the crucifixion in a sense isn't reversed by the resurrection. The crucifixion is validated by the resurrection, the significance of the crucifixion. They are then, the women are given a job, and it's simply, in verse 7 is this: go tell his disciples. Go and tell are the Easter mandate. But of course, this gospel, or I should, before I get to that, I should say, go tell his disciples and Peter. Now that's significant. That may be just a little pointer that this is actually Peter's telling of the story, because I think he would have remembered, it would have been especially meaningful to him that Peter, in some particular way, is being invited to come and meet Jesus up in Galilee. And of course, we know why that would have been so significant, because Peter has a central piece in the denial and betrayal of Jesus in the Passion story. So they're told to go and tell his disciples, but the gospel then ends on this note: trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. This is what the empty tomb and the message of an angel produced in them: trembling, bewilderment. They went out, they fled, they said nothing, they were afraid. That's what an empty tomb does by itself. It is clear that an empty tomb would not have been enough. There's a critical piece missing, and it is missing here in Mark. And what I want to simply end by raising a couple questions for you to think about before we get together on Tuesday evening with each other. So first I want to ask this: what is the contemporary significance of the fact that women were the earliest witnesses? What does that say to us? If in the first century, the women were the initial ones in on this story, what does that say to us? So be thinking about that. The other question I want to end with is this. On one hand, this seems like an unsatisfying end to the gospel. Why end on such a downer note? They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. The last word of the Greek text of Mark is the word fear. Why end a gospel like that? Can you see, the upside of a gospel ending like this? What does this sort of ending, what does it ask us to do, or what does it demand of us? What does an open-ended story do to those who hear it or those who read it? So there are all my little introductory notes and comments. We're going to pick this up on Tuesday evening at 7 o'clock. I, again, will send you a link to a Zoom call. And it's going to take me, again, a few weeks to figure out how best to do this. And I hope we'll get better. We're going to do 8 weeks. We're going to look at each of the gospel accounts, but we're also going to look at other New Testament witnesses to the resurrection in the letters of Paul. Those are actually the earliest, you might say, resurrection accounts. We know that some of the letters of Paul come before the Gospels were written, So they are important witnesses too. And Paul's own story of his encounter with the resurrected Jesus is an important resurrection witness as well. So thanks for being a part of this. I'm going to now awkwardly have to get up and turn behind my camera. I'm going to try to find a remote thing so I can just start and stop the camera without me having to get up. But blessings to you. I'm looking forward to this study. Thanks for signing up to be a part of it. And I'll probably see you hopefully tomorrow, Sunday morning at worship, but then on Tuesday evening. God bless you.